Hey everyone, in this video we're going to come back and take a look at Latin adjectives. So we've done in a previous video a little bit on what they are and kind of how we use them in general, but now we really want to think more specifically about how we organize them. Okay, so if you stop and think about it, there are hundreds and thousands of different words we can use as adjectives, right, to describe things. And the question is there a way of organizing them in Latin? Because in English there really isn't one, right? All the adjectives sound different. You could say things like hot, cold, happy, sad. There's no real rhyme or reason to it. But in Latin, there is a way to organize it, and that's what we're going to dive into in this video. And this will just be sort of a starter to get you moving in the right directions on adjectives, and then we'll have a couple follow-ups where we really dive into the grammar of how they're used, in Latin sentences. But for now, we'll just kind of do an intro one on what they are and how we organize them. So just to refresh your memory, an adjective is a describer word. Right? It's a word that describes either a noun or a pronoun. And like I said, you've seen these all the time, and hopefully you understand what they are already. But just in case, it's words like hot, cold, happy, sad, anything where you're describing a person or a thing, or even like a pronoun, a name. That's an adjective. Okay, so once we have the hang of it, it's pretty easy to spot in English, right? Things like the hungry lion, right? Maybe the hungry lion wants the delicious looking bunnies. There you go, right? Hungry is an adjective describing lion, and delicious is an adjective describing the bunnies. Okay, so it's pretty straightforward in English, and we all pretty much, if English is your first language, you know how to do this pretty early on, particularly by the time you reach high school. Hopefully, you feel really comfortable with this. But just in case you've never thought about it in a while, or you've kind of lost track of some of the specific grammar of what an adjective is, I know sometimes we speak the language and don't really think about the grammar as you go. It's a good time to just stop, step back, and make sure that you understand that before you move too far forward, so you don't get confused when we start going into Latin. So, with that being said, let's get started and dive right in. So the question really is, how do we organize Latin adjectives? And again, I'll go back to what I said at the beginning of the video. In English, there really is no organization, right? So we said the hungry lion and the delicious bunnies. Hungry and delicious are spelled completely different ways. There's not really any connection between them. Sometimes words kind of look similar, but it's not the same way as in Latin. In Latin, the lucky thing for us is that you can organize them. And it's actually really easy to spot. And once you get the hang of it, it'll show you how organized and sort of repetitive the pattern is in the language. So let me just show you with some examples so you can see this a little bit better. If I give you these Latin adjectives, what do you notice about it? Right? So we have the words laetus, which means happy, eratus aum, which means angry, maximus, which is greatest, bonus, which is good, and perpetuus, which means lasting or everlasting, you might say. And again, you want to notice that we listed here they're masculine, feminine, and neuter forms. And that's the thing that you want to catch on to, right? Even if you don't worry about the gender and what these are, just notice the pattern. They all end in us, right? So even though the beginning of the word is completely different, you have light, erat, maxim, bone, and perpetu, right? That's not the part you're looking at. Remember, Latin is all about endings. We've been doing this for a while now, looking at the endings of the words. And the ending is very repetitive. There's a pattern here, us, So that's really good for us because now we can kind of organize these adjectives just like we did with nouns. And the terminology that we use is declension, which is what we use when we were talking about nouns. We organize Latin nouns into groups that we call declensions. Same thing with adjectives, right? We also call them declensions. It's just a fancy name for a group. Okay. And the good news is that you can track the pattern and it makes them a lot easier to use, remember, and even predict, right? Which is good for us. Anytime we can kind of simplify or organize the language, it'll really help us out. So what's the first group called? Well, you just saw them. The adjectives that use that us, ending pattern are called first and second declension adjectives. Now that might sound a little weird. Why didn't we just call them first declension or second declension? No, it's called first and second or first/second declension adjectives. And the reason for this has to do with something I hit on before, the gender. So the endings us, are representing the masculine, feminine, and neuter forms of these words. Right? So us is masculine, is feminine, and is neuter. And these endings are the exact same as first and second declension noun endings. This is why we call them first and second declension adjectives, right? It kind of makes sense because they're using the same endings. So, for example, here are the endings for first and second declension adjectives if you put them into a chart. And pay attention, the masculine, right? Masculine column will just go down. You have us, o. That's the exact same thing as second declension singular nouns. They also go usio. The feminine side, I, am, That's the exact same thing as first declension nouns. So this is why we call them first and second declension adjectives, because they're using the same endings as first and second declension nouns. So in this case, the feminine column for adjectives really is the first declension for nouns, and the masculine and neuter are the second declension for nouns, right? And we do the same thing. We organize it by masculine and neuter. So with adjectives, the gender is really what's setting this all off. We have the three genders, and we just call them first and second declension adjectives. That's it, okay? So even though we're getting a new chart, right, you might be stopping here and thinking to yourself, man, do I really need another chart in Latin? It's actually the exact same one we've been using for a while, so that shouldn't freak you out too much, right? Which is why it's nice. Adjectives and nouns, there's a lot of overlap here. Okay, so again, it doesn't seem that bad, right? Pretty easy. You know the noun ending chart, you know the adjective ending chart. This is pretty straightforward. The unfortunate thing is there's more, all right? So don't panic, but there's more than just those us, adjectives. Let's take a look, okay? What if I give you this group of adjectives? What do you notice about them, okay? So we have nobilis, which means noble, omnis, which is all, difficilis, which means difficult, facilis, which means easy, and similis, which means similar, okay? What do you notice about these? Well, they're not using us, endings, right? Instead, they're all ending with is, a, right? So something completely different is happening here. They're still adjectives, but they are not using those us, endings. These are what we call third declension adjectives, okay? So when you see an adjective that has the endings is, a, and again, those are representing the masculine, feminine, and neuter forms, they're called third declension adjectives. The reason we call them this is because they look pretty similar to third declension nouns. They're not exactly the same, but they're pretty close, right? So we call them third declension. And again, those endings is, a, they just represent the masculine, feminine, and neuter forms. And you can actually see it right here. This is a chart of third declension adjectives. So the masculine column, we have is, eme. And notice how the masculine and feminine are the exact same thing, is, eme. And on the neuter side, we have a, is, ae. Right? Remember the short E is the same for nominative and accusative. That's because with neuter nouns and adjectives, nominative and accusative are always the exact same thing. Okay? But there are some differences here, and this is what you really want to pay attention to. So I've still got the chart here for you, but you want to notice that third declension adjectives, they're probably going to have the exact same thing for masculine and feminine. You could really combine that into one chart, but that's okay. Most of the time they overlap. The ablative singular is a long I, not the short E. So if you think of the third declension noun ending chart, we would say, blank is ema, right? And the A at the end is that short E. Here, though, it's a long I, so something different is happening. So it's a minor little tweak from third declension nouns. Also, the genitive plural is ium, not um. Right, so if we sing the noun ending song, you get the third declension. The plural usually goes ace, ibus, ace, ibus. It's not it's eo, right? ium. And again, the plural form for the neuter, the nominative and accusative, which are always the same thing, it's ia instead of just a. So what you're really seeing here is that we're putting I where you might not normally expect it for third declension nouns. So there's a couple little tweaks. It's not a major deal. Even if you just went with third declension noun endings, the ones you're used to, you'd still probably be pretty close. So it's not a major deal, but it is a little something you just want to pay attention to. But for the most part, these are using the same endings as third declension nouns, which is why we call them third declension adjectives, right? One other quick note you want to have is there's actually some variety in third declension adjectives. So most of them have two forms, right? So for instance, I gave you nobilis, and it's nobilis is a, which means noble. Right? The masculine and feminine are the exact same thing. So more often than not, masculine and feminine, like I said, are the same thing. Sometimes, though, there are three forms, like the adjective sharp, right? Acer. You have acer masculine, acris feminine, and acre neuter. Those are three distinct forms in the nominative singular. So that's why I said most of the time, masculine and feminine are the same. It's not always. And sometimes you only have one. Right? So for instance, the adjective audax, which means bold, right? All three genders are using the same spelling. So sometimes textbooks will call this, adjectives of one termination or two termination. I feel like that's the way it was when I was learning. You don't have to get too hung up on the grammar jargon. Just know that more often than not, masculine and feminine are the same thing. Sometimes they're not, right? And sometimes masculine, feminine, and neuter all use the same endings. It's a minor tweak. It's not really going to throw you off if you're looking for reading skills, you'll still be able to read and translate pretty well. But if you're really trying to do a deep dive into the grammar, I would recommend that you take a minute and kind of look this over. Any textbook will show you how this is done. I'm not going to get too far into it here, just giving you the general overview, but it's just something you want to know. Okay, but still, they're using the same endings afterwards. So in other words, once you dive into past nominative, you're going to see that the endings are pretty straightforward. Okay, so if we put this all into two different categories, we have two different types of adjectives again. The first and second declension, those are the ones that use us, They're really easy to spot in a dictionary, by the way, because you're going to see it listed as us, and they're using the same endings as first and second declension nouns, right? The us, represents masculine, feminine, and neuter. Then you have third declension adjectives. They end in is-a. Often, right? Not always, because like we said, there's only two or only one ending, but in general, is-a is the way to write it. And again, it's pretty easy to spot in a dictionary because you'll notice the is-a endings. They use similar endings to third declension nouns, right? And again, is-a means represents the masculine, feminine, and neuter forms. But one thing you want to remember for third declension adjectives, they can have one, two, or sometimes even three different spellings or forms for the different genders. Okay, so just keep that in mind. They're a little more flexible. So of the two, third declension adjectives tend to be a little bit trickier for my students. The first and second declension is actually pretty straightforward and easy. Once you get the hang of it, you're good. Okay, so hopefully this makes some sense to you and you're not overly panicking. All right. And again, we're just doing the basics in this video. So the thing you want to remember is that Latin adjectives have case, number, and gender. That's a big thing you want to keep track of. Okay. So the gender is important. Case and number, of course, is important. So I want you to stay tuned because now that we've done a little intro into declensions and how we organize adjectives, in the next video, what we'll do is we'll dive into how they're actually used. And I'll show you examples of how we can take a first and second or a third declension adjective and match it up with a noun. It's a little bit trickier, but it comes back to that idea of case, number, gender. So I think it's a really good starting point, hopefully at this point in your Latin career, or just a refresher, to remember what the declensions are and how we organize them. Then we can move on to bigger and better things of how they're actually used, which is, of course, what we're trying to get at when we're reading and writing in Latin. So just to do a quick recap, just like Latin nouns, adjectives use similar endings, right? Which means we can organize them. So if you know that they're all using similar endings, that makes it pretty easy to organize, and that's what we want. The pattern is really what we're after here. They're organized into groups, which we call declensions, and it's based on their endings, right? So the idea of a declension, it's the same thing as Latin nouns. Adjectives use them too. It's just a fancy word for a group. There's two different types, first and second declension adjectives and third declension adjectives. And you want to remember a big key thing is adjectives have case, number, and gender. That's why we keep listing them as either us, or is-a. The spelling of your adjective is going to be different depending on the gender of the noun or the pronoun that it's going with. Okay, and that's going to be the topic of our next video. But for now, just make sure you have these basics down and you should be fine. I would recommend that every time you're looking in the dictionary, you're reading, translating, whatever you're doing, when you come across a Latin adjective and you see it in the dictionary, try to figure out, is it us, or is-a? Once you get good at recognizing that, you'll immediately know what endings it's supposed to have. Okay, so good luck, keep practicing, and you'll be fine.